Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the Rustic Von Lodge, where it's time for my weekly reading report, that amazing program where I talk about all the stuff that I read during the previous week. And I did read some stuff, so let's talk about that stuff. But first of all, I want to acknowledge that it is now finally June, and it's time for June on the Range, a fantastic reading event dedicated to reading Westerns. Yes, it's all about reading Westerns. And I have a whole posse of co-hosts along with me who are all busy talking about June on the Range and all their plans for the things they're going to read and the stuff they're reading and all kinds of other things. I'll leave a link to the entire posse down below in the description box. But it's time for my weekly reading report, so let's do that. I brought along my list for the 500 book challenge, the terrible challenge where I have to read 500 books that I own before I'll buy myself any new ones. And this week, it was one of those weeks where I only finished one book. Only one book. I read some other stuff, but I only finished one book. I'm going to have to make up for that this week. Book number 252 was The Book of Skulls. The Book of Skulls by Robert Silverberg, which I started last week. I talked a little bit about this book. So this book by Robert Silverberg is all about four college students back in the early 1970s who go looking for the Brotherhood of the Skull. See, one of these students found in his university, this student is an expert on ancient and medieval languages, he found a copy of a work called The Book of Skulls, which claims that if you go and find the Brotherhood of the Skulls, which is a weird monastic order, and if you come with three pals, you know, there has to be four of you. If you come, you might become immortal. See, they've got magic powers. They do, these folks in the Brotherhood of the Skull. And what has to happen is that one of you has to commit suicide. One of you has to sacrifice, themselves for the other three, or for at least the other two, to become immortal. And one is going to get murdered. So to become immortal, one of your pals has to kill himself, and one of your other friends you have to murder. Seems like a high price for immortality. You know, your friend's dying and all, but that's the deal. And so one of the college students finds this Book of Skulls, and instead of just thinking it's nonsense, as you normally would, he believes it. He says, yeah, maybe, just maybe, I could become immortal. And so he talks to his roommates, these three other fellas, and they all think it's a great idea. Well, three of them do, and one of them is just along for the ride. And they decide they're going to go find the Brotherhood of the Skulls. And wouldn't you know it, the fella who found the Book of Skulls and translated it also found an article about a strange monastic order in the Arizona desert. And they're all into skulls. I mean, all around their building where they are is a bunch of skulls and stuff. So he figures, this must be the Brotherhood of the Skulls. Let's all take a road trip to the Brotherhood of the Skulls, and we'll, go through these trials, and one of us will kill ourselves, and we'll murder somebody, and we'll become immortal. Two of us will anyway. So that's the idea of the plot. And so it starts off as a road trip with these four college students traveling to find the mysterious Brotherhood of Skulls. And it's interesting. This is a very interesting book. It's a good book. It's a well-written book. It's weird, as you would expect with a plot like that. And going into it, you don't know exactly what kind of book this is going to end up being, because you don't know, how it's going to end. And so it's an interesting book to read. None of the characters are particularly likable. They are all stereotypes, which I think Robert Silverberg did deliberately, because you have the Jewish kid, you have the gay kid, you have the jock, and you have the farm boy. Now, none of these characters who are these stereotypes exactly fit the stereotype that they are, and that becomes clear over the course of the book. None of them are particularly likable. None of these kids are people that you would want to really hang out with, which, should be clear at the very beginning, because each of them are willing to, allow one of their friends to kill themselves, and, they're perfectly willing to murder one of their friends if it means that they will become immortal. I mean, that's the deal, and they've all agreed to it, and they're all going into it in this way. It's a good book. It's interesting. It feels very much like a book from the 1970s. It's very sexually obsessed, which you should expect because it's written by Robert Silverberg, and Robert Silverberg was a really, really good writer. He was also occasionally kind of a perv, when you read some of his books. So when you get to the pervy stuff in this book, you just kind of like, yeah, it's Robert Silverberg. No surprise here. Things that would be shocking if they were in another book. In this book, you're just like, yeah, okay. I kind of expected this. So there's that. It's interesting. I've seen this book actually labeled as a science fiction book. In fact, I think this is in the science SF Masterworks series. The SF Masterworks series, I think, has the Book of Skulls in it, which is ridiculous because this is not a science fiction book. There is not even the tiniest, littlest bit of science fiction in this book at all. So it cannot be considered a science fiction book, even though Robert Silverberg wrote it. Robert Silverberg wrote other things besides science fiction, and this is not a science fiction book. It could barely be called fantasy, I think. It's a lot closer to fantasy than science fiction, but only barely, and only if you interpret it in a certain way. What this is, though, if it's anything, is a horror novel. And so it worked very well, actually, for the final week of Horror Mayhem, another great BookTube event, which went on all of May. It works very well as a horror novel because basically it is about a death cult out in the desert. There's a cult out in the desert, and the creepy people in this cult are perfectly happy, to sanction murder and suicide. They're way into that because they're basically a death cult. And then you have these 4 other college students basically going to their doom. I mean, 2 of them are going to kill themselves. One of them's going to kill themselves. One of them's going to be murdered if everything works out the way they expect. And the other 2 are going to become immortal. But what is the cost of that? Because you get the distinct feeling that the cost is going to be more than just the death of 2 of the group. For example, once they get there, will they be allowed to leave, or will they be cursed forever to be members of this crazy cult? All along the way there, I was wondering, so what's going to happen to them once they get to this crazy cult? Well, you find out, because the second half of the book is all about that, when they finally reach their destination. I won't reveal the ending, but it is, it is suitably creepy, the whole book. And like I said, it's a good book. I think it's closer to being a horror novel than anything else. That's just how I feel about it. But it's certainly worth a read. Just know it's a Robert Silverberg book, and there's going to be some pervy stuff in it. Just no going in. That it's, there's some of that going on. But it's awesome. And look at this great cover. That cover is fantastic. So The Book of Skulls. This was an interesting book. And like I said, I do recommend it. It's got kind of a folk horror vibe in a way, because it features this crazy, perhaps ancient cult, this death cult that's hanging out there in the desert. It's interesting and suitably creepy. So Book of Skulls, that was the one book that I finished, but it's not all that I read. I've been reading, because now it is June on the Range, I had to start off June on the Range with a Western, and I started off with this Western. This is The Virginian by Owen Wister, who many consider to be the very first Western. Is it the first Western? Maybe. It certainly is the book that created many of the Western tropes that became Western stereotypes in a way. A lot of the stuff you find in other Westerns, you first find in this book, The Virginian. It was enormously popular when it was published in 1902. I think it was 1902 when this was first published as a book. And it's excellent. It's the book for this month, for June, for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. Roger, unfortunately, couldn't join me. He is back at the manor. I'm sure he's being perfectly behaved, and that I, won't come home to horrific carnage. But we'll see. But it is part of Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, the cheapest book club around. Everything in Roger's Cheap Old Book Club is available for free on Project Gutenberg if you want to get it there, including this book, The Virginian. So, yeah, this is a suitable place to start for June on the Range. I'm over halfway through it. I've got like 100-something pages to go in The Virginian. And it's really good. This is a really good book. The first thing I noticed in reading this book is that I thought I had read this book, but I have never read this book. I was certain that I had. But once I started reading it, I'm like, I have no memory of this. I don't think I've ever read this before. So this is actually the first time I've read The Virginian. Surprise, surprise. It surprised me. I was sure this is a book I had read. But it goes that way with Westerns. There's just so many of them that, it's hard to remember all the books that you've read in the Western genre. This one from Owen Wister is interesting, not only because it could be considered the very first Western, but because it's a book without a real plot. Or probably more accurate to say would be that it's a book with a lot of plots. Because this is an early example of a fix-up novel, which became very common in science fiction, where you would take a bunch of stories that were previously published and adapt them and work them into a novel. That's basically what happened with The Virginian. A lot of this was published previously as short stories and then was adapted into this novel, The Virginian. The whole book is about the Virginian, and it's really more of a character study than anything else. The Virginian, which is kind of the prototype for the strong, silent cowboy hero. You never learn his name. He's just the Virginian or the Southerner, as far as how he is referred. And he works at Judge Henry's ranch. And he starts off as just a ranch hand, and he becomes the foreman at the ranch. He develops a friendship with the narrator of this book, who is another guy that we never learn his name. We know he's from the East. He comes to the ranch to visit the judge, and he is just known as the Tenderfoot. But the Tenderfoot and the Virginian become friends, and so the Tenderfoot, who knows the Virginian for years, is telling the story of the Virginian. And it's actually, like I said, a lot of stories about the Virginian. There's more than one story here, which makes up this novel. And it's basically the adventures and of the Virginian, the different episodes that he has in the book. He falls in love with a young woman who's the school teacher for the area. And like I said, you have a lot of adventures in here and a lot of things that happen that become very common in the Western genre. it's a really well-written book. And Owen Wister, who actually traveled in the West during the 1880s, he gives you a really accurate portrait in some places of the places that he's talking about. And so even though some of the stories are a bit fanciful and a bit humorous, in other places, you can kind of see the realism in what he's talking about. For example, when he talks about Western towns, like the first Western town you come across in this story, it's not the cleanest place in the world, for example. It's full of garbage. And the Tenderfoot tells you about how this place is full of garbage and old bottles and old cans, and there are more flies there than he's ever seen. Which is, if you're used to Western films and perhaps other Western novels, you don't get that realistic portrait of a Western town. You never see the garbage in Western you never see the garbage in the alleys in Western films. And rarely is that kind of thing talked about in Western novels. But it is here because it's something that Owen Wister came across when he traveled to the West. And so when he's talking about it, you do get the sense that a lot of things that happen in this book are things that did happen, that he, experienced, and he worked them into this novel. It does have that feel to it. And so it's a really fascinating thing to read. I'm not finished, but I've got, like I said, 100 pages left. And it's really good. It's a really good read. And I'm enjoying it tremendously. I probably will finish this by tomorrow. And then I will read something else. So that's what I'm reading right now. It's not the only thing I'm reading. I am, of course, still reading the Fantastic Four. I'm reading every issue of the Fantastic Four from the first run of the Fantastic Four. It is part of my Marvel Master Plan, where I'm reading all of the iconic Marvel superheroes in their first runs that began in the 1960s. And I'm at the Fantastic Four now. And I'm reading John Byrne's classic run in the Fantastic Four. That's where I'm at. And I'm getting towards the end of John Byrne's run on the Fantastic Four. This is not my favorite period of his time on the Fantastic Four. The Thing is gone from the team, and the Thing has been replaced by She-Hulk. I have nothing against She-Hulk, but She-Hulk is not the Thing. And so I really am missing the Thing in these issues. The next issue I have to read is an annual, double-sized annual, number 19, actually. And the last story that I read, which I read this morning, was not a very good story. This is from, in my opinion, this is from the Fantastic Four, 285. And in this tragic story, which also happens to be a Secret Wars 2 crossover, Secret Wars 2 was one of the lamest crossover series ever, where the mysterious Beyonder, who took all the superheroes to Battle World in Secret Wars 1, shows up as a very 1980s character in very 1980s clothes. And he's like the lamest, omnipotent, godlike character you'll ever come across in comics. But anyway, this story is about Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, and how this little kid, Johnny Storm, is his hero. And one day, this little kid, who is of course bullied and treated terrible and neglected by his parents, decides one day to get some rocket fuel, or that is left around by this very neglectful adult, and light himself on fire so that he could become like the Human Torch. Now, back in the 70s, there were parents and people apparently who were worried about little kids lighting themselves on fire to become the Human Torch. I never knew of any single case where this happened. But John Byrne picked up this idea and had this kid, whose hero is the Human Torch, do this. And so the Human Torch finds out about it. He's terribly depressed, and he decides, You know, should I even continue being the Human Torch if this little kid did this? But then the Beyonder shows up and does a couple pages of showing Johnny Storm, how this little kid, you know, while he was still alive, just loved Johnny Storm, and how the Human Torch was the only good thing in his life, and how the Human Torch was his hero. And so after this, the Human Torch decided, you know what? That's great. I did some good, and so I'm the Human Torch and everything's fine. Yeah, but the kid did light himself on fire. Oh, well. It all ends well. Thanks, Beyonder. It was kind of a lame story. So hopefully in the next story, we'll get to some good superheroics. So I'm also reading Tomb of Dracula. It's all Steve Donoghue's fault. He talked me into reading Tomb of Dracula again. So I am, and this is the Essential Tomb of Dracula, which is one of the ways that I have all the issues of Tomb of Dracula. And I have read the first 6 issues of the Tomb of Dracula, which are the issues written by people who are not Marv Wolfman. So we've had Archie Goodwin. We had the whole thing started off with a story by Gary Conway. And now finally in issue number 7, we're going to get Marv Wolfman. And Marv Wolfman stayed with the book for the rest of the book. And he starts writing it in issue 7, which is the story I'm going to read tonight. This comic book is fantastic. And I actually liked the first few issues of Tomb of Dracula, even the ones that were not written by Marv Wolfman, because they're really good. And they have fantastic artwork by Gene Colan. The whole series, the whole regular series of Tomb of Dracula had artwork by Gene Colan, which looks just magnificent in this essential volume. So, yeah, read the first few issues of this, and it's fantastic. Highly recommend this series, and in whatever way you can manage to read it. They're easily available electronically. And they are reprinting the first Tomb of Dracula omnibus, I think, sometime this year. So that's a worthwhile investment. Has the first 30-something issues, I think. But yeah, I'm reading this, Tomb of Dracula, and it's fantastic. I also brought up Werewolf by Night, because I'm going to start reading this again, too. Werewolf by Night actually showed up, believe it or not, before Tomb of Dracula did, by a couple months. So the werewolf actually was the first Marvel monster to be published, not Dracula. Everybody thinks it was Dracula because that was like the best Marvel series that lasted the longest. But actually, the werewolf was a couple months ahead when he showed up in Marvel Spotlight. But I haven't read this yet, and I don't know that I'm going to get to it today, because I'll probably just keep reading The Virginian because it's really good. So as far as regular books go, what am I going to be reading next? It depends. One of two things. Up here at the lodge, I do have a bunch of Westerns, including this one. This is Luke Short's The Stalkers. And I haven't read this Western yet, but I usually really like Luke Short. So if I finish The Virginian tonight or tomorrow morning, I might just continue on with Westerns and The Stalkers, or I might read my first Book Trek book, which is going to be this one, Star Trek Deep Space Nine: The Siege by Peter David, who we sadly lost very recently. I like Star Trek Deep Space Nine a lot. So this came in the first season. So this was the first original novel. Peter David had only seen the first... Actually, I don't know if he even saw the episodes, whether he just read the scripts. But I think he only either saw or read the scripts for the first 4 or 5 episodes. So he didn't know the show very well. And he was aware of that, writing the book. This became a truly great Star Trek show. During the first season, it wasn't that great, but it was good. But it became really, really great. Perhaps the best Star Trek show of all. Perhaps. So yeah, I'm going to be reading this for Book Track, but I don't know whether I'll be reading this next or not. And I think that's all I have to say for today. I We'll catch you next time.